Cities do not collapse in a single night. They erode slowly in decisions no one questions anymore. There was once a valley so fertile it was compared to paradise. Its cities shimmered in the desert sun. Trade flourished. Wealth multiplied. Architecture rose confidently toward the sky. Travelers admired it. Merchants envied it. Leaders desired it. But prosperity can hide something dangerous, a culture that begins to believe it answers to nothing beyond itself. What if destruction is not the result of one terrible act, but the final echo of thousands of small moral compromises? What if the true story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not about fire falling from the heavens, but about how a society slowly lost the ability to recognize right from wrong and called it progress? Tonight, we do not revisit this ancient account as myth or warning. We examine it as a case study in how civilizations unravel from within. Welcome to Hidden Origins. In this episode, we explore the deeper structure behind one of history's most debated narratives, not spectacle, but pattern. Long before their names became synonymous with catastrophe, Sodom and Gomorrah were symbols of success. They stood in the southern region of the Jordan Valley, an area that in antiquity was remarkably fertile. Geological evidence suggests that this basin once supported agriculture, livestock, and sustained trade. The land was described as lush and abundant, a rare oasis within a demanding desert landscape. And in the ancient world, land meant power. Control over fertile territory translated into economic leverage. Caravans traveling between Mesopotamia and Egypt passed near this corridor. Goods flowed, wealth accumulated, infrastructure expanded. These were not primitive settlements. They were organized, functioning city-states with leadership, markets, and defense structures. Their strength was not accidental, it was engineered. But prosperity can create insulation. When a society grows wealthy enough, it can begin to detach from external accountability. Self-sufficiency becomes self-importance. Independence slowly morphs into moral autonomy. Ancient descriptions of Sodom emphasize something often overlooked: abundance. The city had fullness of bread, meaning surplus. Surplus is powerful. It eliminates urgency. It removes dependence. It reduces vulnerability. And vulnerability, paradoxically, keeps communities ethical. When survival is no longer at stake, priorities shift. Compassion can become optional. Hospitality, once sacred in desert cultures, can turn into suspicion or hostility. Justice systems can begin to favor the powerful. Outsiders may be viewed as threats rather than guests. Over time, cultural norms harden. We often imagine moral collapse as chaos, but historically it looks orderly at first. Institutions still function, streets remain clean, commerce continues, but underneath, shared moral boundaries begin dissolving. The ancient narrative surrounding Sodom does not focus first on spectacle. It highlights social behavior. The issue was not simply personal vice, it was collective corruption, a culture where exploitation was normalized, where the vulnerable were unprotected, where arrogance replaced accountability. Civilizations rarely recognize their own tipping points. From inside the system, everything feels stable. Leaders speak confidently. Citizens defend their lifestyle. Critics are dismissed as alarmists. And yet, the story introduces a quiet tension. A man named Lot, a resident of Sodom, occupies a strange position. He is integrated into the city's life, yet he does not fully belong to its moral current. His presence hints that alternatives exist, even within decaying systems. But alternatives are uncomfortable. They challenge consensus. The account suggests that warnings were given, not through thunderous declarations at first, but through subtle signals: unease, confrontation, exposure of injustice. The true fracture was not geological, it was ethical. And when a society begins to redefine cruelty as freedom, when humiliation becomes entertainment, when hospitality becomes hostility, collapse is no longer a question of if, but when. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is often remembered for fire, but the fire was the conclusion, not the beginning. The beginning was moral drift, and drift is almost impossible to detect while you are moving with it. We examine how this drift accelerated and how a prosperous society responded when accountability finally stood at its gates. If you value deep, intelligent explorations of ancient narratives, subscribe to Hidden Origins and continue this journey with us. Prosperity rarely collapses without resistance. When accountability approaches a powerful society, the first response is not repentance, it is denial. The ancient account describes a moment that feels almost quiet at first. Two strangers enter the city gates of Sodom at dusk. In the ancient Near East, the city gate was more than an entrance, it was the center of civic life. Legal disputes were settled there. Business transactions were negotiated there. Authority was displayed there. The arrival of outsiders in such a place was never neutral. Hospitality in desert cultures was sacred. Survival often depended on how travelers were treated. To protect a stranger was to uphold civilization itself. To violate that code was to fracture a foundational ethic. Lot sees the visitors and insists they stay under his roof. His urgency is striking. He knows the city. He understands its atmosphere. His insistence suggests something is already deeply wrong. The tension escalates quickly. The narrative does not portray random chaos. It describes collective participation. A crowd gathers. The language implies scale, young and old, from every quarter. This was not a private failing. It was communal. When corruption becomes normalized, it no longer hides in shadows. It stands in public squares and demands validation. What makes this moment historically and psychologically significant is not simply the aggression, it is the reaction to resistance. When Lot refuses to surrender his guests, he is mocked as an outsider. This one came to live here, and now he acts as a judge. That sentence reveals everything. Societies in moral drift often reject internal critics more harshly than external enemies. Someone who shares your streets but refuses your standards becomes intolerable. The real threat is not invasion, it is exposure. This pattern repeats throughout history. When dissent is framed as arrogance, when conscience is reframed as judgmentalism, when ethical boundaries are labeled intolerance, a civilization signals that it prefers comfort over correction. The story does not linger on spectacle. Instead, it shifts toward decision. The visitors reveal that the city's condition has reached a threshold. The phrase, often translated as outcry, suggests accumulated grievance, a buildup of injustice so severe that it demands reckoning. Ancient societies understood this idea well. In Mesopotamian and Egyptian literature, cities were sometimes described as weighed or measured. Justice was not merely legal, it was cosmic.
There existed a belief that corruption distorted balance itself. Sodom's evaluation is complete. But what follows is remarkable: dialogue. Before destruction, there is dialogue. The broader narrative includes an earlier exchange in which mercy is discussed. What if there are 50 righteous, 40, 30, 10? This is not arbitrary judgment, it is measured restraint. The threshold is not perfection, it is presence. The survival of a society, according to the story's logic, depends on whether a small nucleus of justice still exists within it. If even a small nucleus of justice remains, catastrophe can be delayed. But the count falls short.
And here lies the deeper tension. Corruption is not simply about individual acts, it is about saturation. When injustice permeates systems, when exploitation becomes policy, when violence becomes cultural entertainment, the ethical infrastructure collapses. Destruction, in this framing, is less an emotional reaction and more a consequence of structural rot. The final warning to Lot's household is urgent. Leave, do not linger, do not look back. The command not to look back is often misunderstood. It is not about curiosity, it is about attachment. To look back is to hesitate between worlds, to remain psychologically tied to a system already collapsing. Survival requires severance. As night deepens, the valley grows silent. No trumpet announces what is coming, no dramatic countdown, just inevitability. We examine the moment of rupture itself, not as spectacle, but as the culmination of accumulated imbalance. What does it mean for a society to reach the point where reversal is no longer possible? If you are finding value in this layered exploration, subscribe to Hidden Origins and continue with us into the turning point of this ancient account. There is a moment in every system's decline when reversal is still possible, and then a moment when it is not. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah pivots on that invisible boundary. Night covers the valley. Lot and his household are urged to leave before dawn. The urgency suggests that what is coming is not random chaos, but the activation of a decision already reached. Evaluation has concluded. The verdict is set. What remains is execution. But even now, hesitation lingers. The text presents something profoundly human: reluctance. Lot delays. His family wavers. The familiar is difficult to abandon, even when it is failing. Sociologists often observe that individuals remain inside deteriorating systems longer than reason justifies. Stability, even corrupt stability, feels safer than uncertainty. It is one thing to criticize a culture. It is another to detach from it. The command to flee without looking back carries psychological weight. It demands severance not only physically, but emotionally. To escape collapse, one must accept that the world they knew will not continue. Then the rupture comes. Descriptions of fire and sulfur raining from the heavens have echoed for centuries. Yet whether one interprets this as literal divine intervention, geological catastrophe, or theological symbolism, the narrative's emphasis is not on special effects, it is on finality.
The fertile plain becomes uninhabitable. Smoke rises like the smoke of a furnace. The valley, once compared to paradise, is transformed into wasteland. Archaeologists studying the southern Dead Sea region have debated whether seismic activity, bitumen pits, or natural gas ignition could have played a role in an ancient disaster. The region sits along a fault line. Earthquakes have shaped its history. Combustible materials exist in abundance beneath its surface. But even if geological forces were involved, the narrative frames the event as more than tectonic. It is moral culmination expressed through environmental upheaval. Civilizations are fragile when their ethical foundations fracture. And here, the story offers one of its most haunting images: Lot's wife. She turns back. The transformation into a pillar of salt has been interpreted in various ways: literal, metaphorical, symbolic. Salt in the ancient world represented permanence and desolation. To become salt is to become a monument to hesitation. Looking back is not nostalgia. It is attachment to a system already judged unsustainable. Her pause suggests divided loyalty, an inability to release what had defined her identity. Perhaps the city's wealth, its structure, its social position, its familiarity. The image lingers because it is deeply relatable. How often do individuals recognize decay in institutions, yet resist departure because it costs too much? Reputation, comfort, belonging. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is not merely about flames, it is about the cost of clinging to what is collapsing.
Morning arrives. The valley is silent. The cities are gone. But what is striking is not triumph. There is no celebratory tone. The account feels sober, almost restrained. Judgment in this framing is not spectacle. It is tragedy. The fertile plain that once supported life is now barren. Trade routes reroute. Settlements vanish. Memory remains. And memory is powerful. The names of these cities persist across cultures and centuries, not because their destruction was unique. Ancient history is filled with destroyed cities, but because their story became archetype, a template, a case study in saturation. Not sudden wickedness, but normalized corruption. Not immediate catastrophe, but accumulated imbalance. The irreversible threshold was not crossed in a single night. It was crossed gradually, decision by decision, until the structure could no longer hold. As we step back from the smoke and examine what this narrative has meant across history, why it endures, and what it reveals about the anatomy of societal collapse, if this deep exploration is expanding your understanding, subscribe to Hidden Origins and join us for the concluding reflection. When the smoke clears in ancient narratives, what remains is rarely just ruin. What remains is interpretation. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah did not end with geography. It began a legacy. Their names detached from physical coordinates and became symbols. Across centuries, theologians, historians, philosophers, and political thinkers revisited the account, not simply to describe what happened, but to understand why it mattered. And that question is more enduring than the flames. Why do certain civilizations fall while others endure? Why does prosperity sometimes accelerate decline rather than prevent it? Why do societies often recognize corruption only after collapse? The narrative suggests that material success can coexist with ethical erosion. Wealth does not guarantee wisdom. Infrastructure does not ensure integrity. Stability does not equal sustainability. In fact, prosperity can amplify moral drift by removing the immediate consequences of injustice. When a system is economically strong, it can afford to ignore ethical fractures longer. Exploitation can be absorbed. Inequality can be rationalized. Excess can be celebrated. But imbalance compounds. The ancient world understood this intuitively. Civilizations were often described as being weighed. Justice was conceptualized as equilibrium. When cruelty outweighed compassion,
when arrogance overshadowed humility, when power eclipsed responsibility, imbalance demanded correction. In the case of Sodom, the decisive factor was not private immorality alone, it was systemic failure. The vulnerable were not protected, strangers were not welcomed, conscience was ridiculed, correction was rejected. When a culture begins to mock its own moral restraints, it erodes the very framework that protects it.
What makes this narrative powerful is not that destruction occurred. History is filled with destroyed cities. What makes it powerful is the pattern it outlines. First, abundance. Then, insulation. Then, normalization of harm. Then, rejection of accountability. Then, sudden exposure of fragility. The collapse appears swift only because the internal decay was invisible to those inside it. And this is where the story transcends geography. Sodom and Gomorrah function as mirrors. Every generation reads the account and asks, consciously or unconsciously, are we immune to this pattern, or are we simply at a different stage of it? The narrative does not offer a simplistic answer. It does not claim that every disaster is moral punishment, nor that every society in decline will face dramatic annihilation. Instead, it provides a structural warning. Civilizations depend on ethical foundations as much as economic ones. Remove the moral architecture, and the physical architecture cannot stand indefinitely. There is also a quieter thread woven into the account: mercy. Before destruction, there was dialogue. Before finality, there was negotiation. Before collapse, there was opportunity for preservation. The threshold was not perfection, it was the presence of enough integrity to stabilize the system. The tragedy of Sodom was not merely that it was judged, it was that it lacked the internal core required to endure. In the aftermath, the valley remained as evidence. Barren land where fertility once thrived. A reminder that environments, social and physical, reflect the conditions imposed upon them. The story's endurance across millennia suggests something profound. Humanity recognizes itself in it. We recognize the temptation to redefine standards for convenience. We recognize the impulse to silence dissent. We recognize the comfort of blending in to prevailing norms. And we recognize how difficult it is to leave a system we know is failing. The final image of the narrative is not fire, it is distance. Survivors standing on higher ground, looking at what once was, aware that an entire civilization believed itself untouchable just hours before. History is not preserved merely to inform us about the past. It is preserved to expose patterns. Sodom and Gomorrah endure not because of spectacle, but because of structure. Their fall is a study in moral entropy, the slow decay of standards beneath the surface of strength. The unsettling reality is this: collapse rarely announces itself with thunder. It whispers through small compromises, justified decisions, and applauded excess until the foundation gives way. And when that moment comes, the question is no longer whether the city was impressive. The question is whether it was stable. If you value deep, thoughtful examinations of the hidden structures behind history's most enduring accounts, subscribe to Hidden Origins and continue exploring the patterns that shape civilizations. Because sometimes the most ancient stories are not about the past at all. They are about us.